The room was already quiet when I walked in. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that comes after a good meal or a long rest. It was the kind that presses down on you, the kind that makes the air feel heavy and thick. 12 members of the Keth High Council sat behind a curved table of pale stone, their four eyes unblinking, their antennae folded flat against their skulls. That posture meant one thing among my kind. It meant they were afraid of what they were about to hear. Good. They should be. My name is Vrail 9. I am a sergeant of the 4th Boundary Legion, Keth Hegemony. I have served in 14 armed conflicts across 9-star systems. I have faced the Goric Swarm, the armored columns of the Drenethi Republic, and the chemical hunters of the Outer Rim. I'm not a soldier who frightens easily. I say that not to impress anyone in this room. I say it because what I am about to tell you will sound like the words of a frightened soldier, and I want the record to show that there is a difference between fear and wisdom. I requested this testimony be recorded in full, without summary or edit. The council agreed. I will hold them to that. I first encountered humans during the early campaign on the colony world of Duan 4. Our intelligence reports describe them in flat, clinical terms. Bipedal, mammalian, moderate size, limited sensory range, short lifespan. The reports noted their weapons technology was behind ours by approximately 80 years, and that their armor was primitive by any measurable standard. Based on those reports, the 4th Boundary Legion was given a timetable of 6 planetary rotations to secure the southern continent. I want to be precise here. We did not fail to secure the southern continent because humans were smarter than us, or because their weapons were secretly superior, or because of any strategic mistake on our part. We failed because our intelligence reports, written by analysts who had never shared a battlefield with a human being, missed the single most important fact about the species. They do not stop. I do not mean that in a poetic sense. I mean in the most literal, physical way possible. When a Keth warrior is wounded badly enough, the body initiates a withdrawal response. It is biological. The nervous system sends a signal that overrides conscious choice. The body pulls back from the source of damage. Every species we have ever fought shares some version of this mechanism. It is not cowardice. It is biology. It is the body protecting itself so that it might recover and fight another day. Humans do not have this mechanism. Or if they do, it does not work the same way. The first time I saw it, I thought I was seeing a malfunction. One of their soldiers had taken 2 direct hits from our plasma rifles. I watched it happen from a ridge 40 meters away. The first hit took him in the shoulder and spun him sideways. The second hit him in the lower torso. He fell. He went down hard, face in the dirt, and I remember the instant of relief I felt. The engagement had lasted 9 minutes. Our squad had lost 1 soldier. The math was acceptable. Then he got up. Not quickly, not smoothly. He pushed himself up on one arm first, and then dragged his legs under him. And then he was standing, something close to standing, hunched forward, one arm hanging loose at his side. He still had his weapon in his other hand. He looked at the ridge where our squad was positioned. He raised the weapon. I pulled my soldiers back before he could fire. Later, 2 of my unit members questioned the order. They told me a single wounded human posed no real threat to a positioned squad of 6. They were right mathematically. I pulled us back anyway. I cannot explain it then. I can explain it now. What I had seen on that ridge was not a wounded enemy making a last desperate effort before collapse. What I had seen was something that considered 2 plasma hits to be an inconvenience and not a reason to stop. And if that one soldier felt that way, then the other 6 soldiers in his unit felt the same way. And if all of them felt that way, then every human on that battlefield operated under a completely different set of rules than anything we had trained for. We spent 3 full rotations trying to hold a river crossing that our models said should take 4 hours. The humans hit us in the early morning, which their planet's biology had apparently optimized them for. And they hit hard and fast, and without any of the organized hesitation that marks the opening moves of every military force we had ever studied. When we pushed back, they fell away. When we held ground, they came back. When we thought we had finally broken a unit, the unit would reappear from a different direction 20 minutes later, smaller, running low on supplies, still completely willing to fight. On the 4th rotation, I sent a message to command requesting a revised timetable. My commanding officer, A senior strategist named Orvith 3 sent back a single line in reply. It said that my unit was suffering from low morale and that I should recalibrate my expectations. Orvith 3 died on the 9th rotation, in a corridor he had declared fully secured. The humans had come back through it. I'm not telling this story to assign blame. Orvith 3 was a good officer and a better tactician than most. What he lacked was not intelligence. What he lacked was a certain kind of imagination, the kind that lets you look at something completely unlike yourself and take it seriously on its own terms instead of measuring it against what you already know. We all lack that in the beginning. There was a young soldier in my unit named Seth 11. He was new to field duty and had come from a training program that prepared soldiers for engagement against the Drenethi, who fight in rigid, geometric formations that are devastatingly effective but utterly predictable once you know the counters. Seth 11 was very good at reading Drenethi formations. He had no framework at all for what he saw on Duan 4. On the 6th rotation, Seth 11 watched a group of human soldiers carry one of their wounded across 2 kilometers of contested ground while under intermittent fire. Not quickly, not silently. It took them most of an hour. They took turns. They rotated the carry, so no single person got too tired. They stopped twice when the fire got heavy, laid the wounded soldier down carefully, returned fire until it lessened, and then picked the wounded soldier back up and kept moving. Seth 11 came to me afterward and said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "Sergeant, I do not understand. If they had left him, they would have moved faster. They would have been harder to track. They could have set up a position and caused us real trouble. Carrying him makes them slower and more visible. It is the tactically wrong choice." I told him he was correct. It was the tactically wrong choice. Humans make it every time. What Seth 11 had identified, without quite realizing it, was that human tactical decision-making operates on 2 levels simultaneously. There's the level of objectives, ground, ammunition, and survival. And then there's a second level that sits underneath all of that never turns off, that governs the first level whether or not the situation calls for it. That second level is about the other humans in the unit, what they owe each other, what it means to leave someone behind. It is not a switch they turn on during quiet moments. It is simply always on, even when it costs them. We found this baffling. We continue to find it baffling for a long time. On the 9th rotation, the same rotation Orvith 3 died in that secured corridor, I made a decision that saved the lives of every soldier under my command. I ordered a complete withdrawal from the river crossing and repositioned us 8 kilometers to the east on higher ground, away from any human patrol routes. I did not report this to command immediately. I waited until we were in position, and then I filed the movement as a tactical redeployment. Orvith 3 would have ordered us back. He would have called it retreating from an inferior force, and he would not have been entirely wrong. The humans at the river crossing were smaller in number than our unit, lighter in armor, running low on ammunition and food. By the standards of every engagement I had trained for, they should have broken 2 rotations earlier. They had not broken. They were not going to break. And staying near them meant staying in range of something I had not yet found a word for. The word I eventually settled on was persistence. But that is not quite right either, because persistence implies a kind of struggle, a continuous effort against resistance. What I witnessed in the humans was something smoother and more unsettling than that. It was not that they pushed through pain or fear or exhaustion with great visible effort. It was that those things appeared to slow them down without stopping them, the way a strong wind slows a walker without making the walker turn around. They simply factored the difficulty into their pace and kept going. By the time I filed my testimony with this council, the 4th Boundary Legion had been involved in 31 separate engagements with human forces across Duan 4. We won 14 of them by any objective measure of territory and casualties. We lost 9 outright. The remaining 8 ended in a kind of mutual exhaustion that left no clear winner. In those 31 engagements, not once did I observe a human unit break under pressure and retreat in disorganized flight the way our training materials described as the expected outcome of sufficient force applied consistently. Not once. There were retreats. There were planned withdrawals. There were moments where human units pulled back to regroup. But those moves were chosen, not forced. The difference is enormous. One of the council members, an elder named Soth, too, asked me at this point in my testimony whether the humans had sustained heavy casualties during these engagements. He seemed to think this was a meaningful question. I told him the answer was yes. Human casualties were significant throughout the campaign. Many of their soldiers did not survive. He nodded as if this supported some conclusion he had already drawn. I told him it did not support any comforting conclusion. I told him that human casualties being high was the frightening part, not the reassuring part, because those casualties did not change the behavior of the soldiers who remained. The unit shrank, and then it fought on. The unit shrank further, and then it fought on. The presence of casualties did not alter the fundamental approach of any human force I encountered. If anything, and I want to be careful here because this is the part that is hardest to explain, it sometimes seemed to make them more determined, not less. Soth, too, did not respond to this. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he asked me to continue. I told him that was exactly the thing he needed to understand. The humans had a word for what I was describing. I learned it later from a translated document captured near the end of the campaign. The word was grief. It means the pain you feel when you lose someone you care about. All species have some version of this. For most species, grief is a weight that slows you down and pulls you towards stillness while you process the loss. For humans, grief is sometimes a different kind of fuel. I do not fully understand how this is possible from a biological standpoint. I am a soldier, not a scientist, but I know what I saw on Doin 4. I know that after every loss, after every moment when a human unit should by any rational expectation have reached its limit, those units found a way to keep going. They kept going in the direction of the fight. I pulled my soldiers back on the 9th rotation because I understood, in a way I could not yet fully articulate, that we were not dealing with a military force that would eventually run out of the will to continue. We were dealing with something that had not yet found its limit, and I had no interest in being present when it did. That decision to withdraw, the one my commanding officer would have reversed if he had lived, kept 12 Keth soldiers alive long enough to see the armistice. I think about that sometimes in the quiet after this testimony, when the council members have gone home and I am alone with the recording and the memory of everything I watched on that colony world. I think about that young soldier on the ridge with 2 plasma hits in his body, raising his weapon. I think about the way he stood, not gracefully, not without pain, but upright, facing the direction of the threat. I think about the fact that I still do not entirely understand what I saw. Not because it was complicated, because it was simple in a way I had never encountered before. Simple in a way that my entire military education had not prepared me for. He was hurt. He got up anyway. He raised his weapon. There is no tactical manual in the Keth hegemony that explains what to do with that. When the council took a short recess, I remained in my seat. I did not want food or rest. I wanted to organize my thoughts before the second portion of my testimony, because the second portion is where most Keth soldiers, when they hear it for the first time, make the mistake of laughing. I need them not to laugh. What I'm about to describe is not funny. It was, in fact, the moment I began to truly understand what we were up against. The campaign on Doin 4 entered its 3rd phase during the rainy season. I did not know the planet had a rainy season when we arrived. The intelligence reports mentioned precipitation, but did not emphasize it. This was another oversight that cost us considerably. The rain on Doin 4 is not like rain on Keth Prime. On our homeworld, rain is brief and mild, a feature of climate cycles that causes no particular discomfort and creates no meaningful obstacle for military operations. On Doin 4, the rainy season lasts approximately 40 rotations and transforms the terrain completely. The soil, which in dry conditions is hard-packed and easy to move across, becomes a thick, clinging substance that the humans call mud. It coats everything. It seeps into equipment. It makes every step heavier than the last. It has a smell, a deep organic smell of wet earth and decay that is deeply unpleasant to Keth's sensory organs. We deployed into the Hethra Basin during the 2nd week of the rainy season. Our mission was to establish a forward operating position from which we could monitor and interdict human supply lines running through the lowland valleys. Command had selected the basin because the terrain offered natural cover and the high ground gave us good sight lines. What Command had not adequately calculated was what 40 rotations of rain would do to that terrain or to our soldiers. By the end of the first week in the basin, 3 of my soldiers had developed equipment failures. The exoskeleton joints that augment Keth's soldier mobility had begun to seize in the moisture. The polymer seals that protect our sensory organs from external irritants were failing in ways that caused constant low-level discomfort. Our food supplies, which are designed to be consumed in moderate temperatures, were taking on moisture and becoming difficult to prepare properly. More than the physical problems, the psychological effect of the terrain on my unit was significant. Keth's soldiers evolved in arid environments. We are not biologically suited to prolonged exposure to wet, cold, heavy conditions. By the end of the first week, my unit's performance metrics had dropped measurably. Reaction times were slower. Communication between soldiers was becoming shorter and more irritable. 2 soldiers who had trained together for years had a serious argument over something trivially small. I reported all of this to Command and requested a timeline review. Command told me to continue the mission. I set my soldiers to maintaining equipment as best we could and began sending drones to monitor the human forces we knew were operating in the southern part of the basin. I expected to find them in similar or worse condition. Their armor was lighter than ours. Their bodies were softer, less protected by natural physiology. The mud and rain and cold should have been hitting them harder than it was hitting us. The first drone footage came back after 2 rotations of flight. I reviewed it alone in my shelter before sharing it with the unit, because I wanted to understand what I was looking at before anyone else saw it. The human encampment was set in a shallow depression in the valley floor, chosen, I realized, because the surrounding earth formed a natural windbreak. They had constructed shelters from materials carried in their packs, combined with materials collected from the immediate environment. Branches, large leaves, strips of fabric. The shelters were crude by any architectural standard, but they were surprisingly effective. Heat readings from the drone showed that the interior temperatures of these shelters were significantly higher than the ambient outside temperature. None of this was what stopped me. What stopped me was the sound recording that came with the footage. I played it 3 times before I accepted what I was hearing. They were singing, not in distress, not signaling to each other in any tactical sense. Singing the way you sing when you are at ease, when the moment allows for something that isn't strictly necessary. There were several different voices, imperfectly harmonized, and underneath the singing, I could hear the percussive sound of someone drumming on a hard surface with their hands. There was laughter between verses. I sat with the drone footage for a long time. The rain on the sensor was heavy. The humans were up to their ankles in mud. The ambient temperature readings were low by any comfortable standard, and they were singing. One of my soldiers, a veteran named Peth, 7 who had served with me in 3 previous campaigns, came to check on me, and I showed her the footage without comment. She watched it twice. Then she said, "Do they know we are nearby? Do they think they are safe?" I told her our best estimate was that the human unit was aware of our general presence in the basin. They were not operating as if they believed themselves to be in a secure location. Peth, 7, watched the footage a 3rd time. Then she said something that I have quoted in every briefing I have given since. She said, "Sergeant, I have been in the field for 11 years. When do we ever sing?" The answer is that we do not. Not in the field. Not in conditions like those. For Keth's soldiers, morale under hardship expresses itself as endurance. You keep going. You perform your duties. You manage your discomfort privately, and you do not allow it to affect your operational output. Singing, playing music, laughing, those are things we do at home in warmth after the work is done. They belong to a particular kind of safety and comfort. Humans do not appear to make this distinction. I have since learned, through extensive study of human cultural material, that they have a long history of singing in exactly the conditions I described. During physical labor, during dangerous journeys, during periods of collective hardship. There is a specific body of human music that was created not for entertainment in comfortable settings, but for keeping groups of people psychologically unified when everything around them was difficult. They developed this practice over thousands of years on their home planet, on a world that was frequently trying to end them in various ways, and they brought it with them into space. This cultural habit is not incidental. It is functional. It does something specific to human psychology in adverse conditions that our best scientists are still, as of this testimony, attempting to fully quantify. We attempted to use the rain and mud against them through a tactical operation on the 15th rotation of our stay in the basin. The plan was to hit their encampment in the pre-dawn hours, when energy levels would theoretically be lowest and response times slowest. Our own discomfort in the conditions was severe at this point. 3 soldiers had minor infections from the constant exposure to moisture. Peth, 7, had a recurring equipment failure in her left arm actuator. I myself was running on less rest than I would have preferred, but the tactical window was there and command wanted results. We moved into position through the mud in silence. It was slow, hard work. Every step required effort. The rain was steady and cold. By the time we were in position at the edge of the human encampment, every soldier in my unit was exhausted and uncomfortable and irritable. The human sentry was a young man with light brown hair plastered flat against his head by the rain. He was standing at his post in what appeared to be total stillness. For a moment, I thought he was asleep standing up, which seemed impossible, but also, given what I knew about humans by this point, not something I was willing to rule out. He was not asleep. He was simply still in the particular way that humans can hold stillness when they choose to, without it meaning anything is wrong. He turned 45 degrees, looked directly at the position of one of my soldiers, and made a sharp sound. Not a word, just a sound, short and hard, and carrying a specific information in it. The encampment went from silence to full activity in less time than I had thought possible. Not the panicked, disorganized activity of a force surprised from sleep, but the rapid, practiced activity of people who had planned for exactly this moment. Every human moved to a prearranged position. There was almost no verbal communication. They had prepared for this in advance and rehearsed what each person would do. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. We withdrew with 2 soldiers injured and nothing gained. On the walk back to our own position, through the rain and the mud and the pre-dawn dark, Peth, 7, said to me, "Their sentry wasn't tired." I told her he'd not appear to be tired. No. She said, "We were exhausted and they were not." How is that possible? The conditions are the same. I did not have an answer for her then. I have thought about it many times since. The best answer I can offer is this. Humans evolved on a world that did not become gentle when the conditions were hard. Their ancient home planet had no mercy in its weather, its predators, or its landscape. Humans who could not function when things were unpleasant did not survive long enough to pass their qualities on to the next generation. The humans who did survive were the ones who found ways to not just tolerate misery, but to work within it, to build something within it, even to enjoy small pieces of it. 40,000 years of that kind of pressure produces a species that does not perceive adverse conditions the way we do. For us, hardship is a deviation from the normal state of things. It costs us. It drains us. We perform worse in difficult conditions because difficult conditions are not what we were made for. For humans, difficult conditions are simply conditions. The game does not change. Only the weather does. 3 days after the failed pre-dawn operation, I made contact with a prisoner. She was a field medic named Carla who had been separated from her unit during a skirmish near the Eastern Ridge. She was not wounded. She had simply taken a wrong turn in the dark and walked into a position held by 2 of my soldiers, who brought her in without incident. Under Keth military protocol, I was required to conduct an initial assessment of any prisoner's condition before processing them. I conducted this assessment myself. Carla was cold, wet, hungry, and had been alone in the hostile conditions for approximately 14 hours. By any expected psychological measure, she should have been in a state of significant distress. She was annoyed, not distressed. Annoyed in a specific way of someone whose day has not gone according to plan and who is mildly frustrated about it. I conducted the assessment through a translation unit. When I asked her to describe her physical condition, she said she was fine except for her feet, which were very cold, and that she would like something hot to drink if we had it. I asked whether she found the conditions in the basin difficult. She looked at me with an expression I have since learned to identify as puzzlement. She said the conditions were uncomfortable but not difficult. She said she had done field training in conditions considerably worse than this. She said the thing that was bothering her most was not the cold or the rain, but not knowing where her unit was and whether they were worried about her. There was again the unit. The people. I asked her why she was concerned about whether her unit was worried. I pointed out that from a purely rational standpoint, the emotional state of her colleagues had no bearing on her own physical safety or the likely outcome of her current situation. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Of course it has a bearing. They're my people. I care what they're feeling." I told her that was an interesting priority given her circumstances. She said, "Where I come from, it's the only priority that matters." I released Carla back to her unit the following rotation through a standard prisoner exchange arrangement. Before she left, I asked her one more question. I asked what she thought of the campaign in the basin, what she thought it was doing to human morale. She thought about it for a moment. Then she shrugged, a human gesture that indicates casual dismissal of something. She said, This is just camping." She walked away through the mud. I stood there and watched her go, and the mud was up to my ankle joints and the rain was steady and cold. And I thought about the singing I had heard on the drone footage and the sentry who was not tired, and the way she had said the words, "just camping," as if the entire situation we had carefully constructed to grind down the human was simply a minor deviation from their normal recreational activities. I filed no tactical report that night. I sat in my shelter with the rain on the roof, and I thought about a species that had spent 40,000 years living on a planet that was frequently miserable and had responded by developing a culture that could extract something resembling enjoyment from misery as a matter of survival. We had not planned for that. Not in any of our models. Not in any of our training. Nowhere in the extensive Keth military literature on applied pressure and environmental attrition was there a chapter on what to do when the enemy find your worst conditions merely inconvenient. I wrote to command the following morning and requested we be extracted from the basin and reassigned to operations on higher, drier ground. I gave a full tactical justification. Command approved the request. I did not include in my written request the real reason I wanted us out of there. The real reason was simpler and more honest than anything I put in the official report. The real reason was that I did not want my soldiers to watch what I had been watching and feel what I had been feeling. Because what I had been feeling, standing in the mud in the cold rain, watching a human prisoner walk back to her unit with nothing but mild annoyance at the inconvenience, was something a Keth officer is not supposed to feel. I had been feeling afraid. Not afraid of her weapons. Not afraid of her unit. Afraid of what she represented. Afraid of what it meant that she could stand in the worst conditions we could put her in and find them barely worth commenting on. Afraid of what that said about the gap between what we had prepared for and what we had actually found. We left the Hethra Basin on the 22nd rotation. Behind us, in the valley we had failed to control, the rain continued. And I knew, though I did not say it aloud, that the humans down there were still in it. Still moving. Still working. Still, in all likelihood, occasionally singing. The elder council member Soth, too, interrupted my testimony at this point. He held up one hand in the Keth gesture that requests a pause, and he said, very carefully, that he wanted to raise a specific objection to the direction my account was taking. He said, "Sergeant Vrail, 9, you have described human soldiers as persistent and as tolerant of difficult conditions. These are notable qualities. But persistence and physical tolerance are not, by themselves, decisive advantages. Every species we have fought has had some version of these traits. The Goric swarm persists. The Drenithi endure hardship. What made the humans different beyond the degree?" It was a fair question. It was also, I realized, the question I had been building toward since I first sat down in this room. I told Soth, too, that the degree was part of it. But it was not the whole of it. The whole of it was what humans do with the one thing that, up to that point, the Keth High Command had believed was the ultimate equalizer on any battlefield. Fear. Every sapient species in the known galaxy experiences fear. This is not a coincidence. Fear is one of the oldest biological signals in the universe. It evolved independently in dozens of species across dozens of worlds because it solves a fundamental problem. The problem is, how does a living creature avoid being destroyed by something more dangerous than itself? Fear is the solution. Fear says stop, back away, do not approach this thing, find another path. Fear keeps creatures alive long enough to reproduce and pass on the quality of fearfulness to the next generation. The Keth hegemony developed an entire branch of military science around this fact. We call it psychological operations, though the name is deceptively simple for something very sophisticated. Over 3 centuries of warfare, we had refined our ability to induce, amplify, and weaponize fear in enemy populations to a level that our military scientists considered close to optimal. Our Psychological Operations Division had a perfect record in 22 campaigns against 12 different species. When Command decided to deploy these methods against human forces on Dune 4, I was not in favor of it. Not for any idealistic reason. I opposed it because I had been watching the humans for long enough that I had developed a suspicion, which I could not yet fully articulate, that the playbook would not work the way it was designed to work. I was overruled. The operation went ahead. The Keth Psychological Warfare Package has several components. I will describe the relevant ones without going into technical detail that belongs in classified files rather than an open testimony. The first component is infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of conscious hearing that produce in most sapient species a strong autonomic stress response. The creature does not know why it feels afraid. It simply begins to feel afraid. The second component is an aerosolized compound that, when introduced into a target's breathing air, amplifies cortisol-equivalent chemicals in the bloodstream. Again, the effect is felt without any conscious identification of the cause. The third component is visual projection of tactical information designed to make the situation appear more hopeless than it may actually be. These 3 elements, combined and sustained over a period of 40 to 60 minutes, have been sufficient to break the organized resistance of every force we had previously used them against. The typical outcome was a disorganized retreat that our ground forces could then exploit. In 3 historical cases, the psychological package alone had produced a surrender without any subsequent ground engagement. We introduced all 3 components into a human forward position containing approximately 30 soldiers on the 31st rotation of the campaign. Our monitoring equipment could detect biometric signals at distance, and we had calibrated it to track the human equivalents of the stress indicators that signaled success in previous operations. The heart rate data came back first, elevated significantly. The humans in that position were experiencing a genuine stress response. The compound was working. Their biology was responding exactly as our models predicted. I remember watching the biometric display and waiting. Saf, too, had come to observe the operation personally. He stood beside me at the monitoring station, watching the readings climb. I remember thinking that the readings looked exactly as they should look. And I remember the strange cold feeling that came over me as I realized that the readings looking exactly right was not, in itself, a reassuring thing. Because on the ground, nothing was changing. The human soldiers in that position were biologically afraid. The monitors were very clear about that. Their hearts were beating fast. The chemical indicators of fear were rising. Their pupils, visible on the surveillance feed, were dilated. They were in every measurable physical way in a state of fear, and they were not retreating. Soth, too, said, "Give it more time. The effect usually builds." So we gave it more time. The biometrics climbed higher. One human soldier was reading stress levels that in a Keth individual would have constituted a medical emergency. He was the one who started it. He stood up from his cover position, stepped into the open, and ran directly toward the center of the projected tactical display. Not away from it, toward it. He was moving fast, faster than the biometric reading suggested he should be capable of firing his weapon in a wide pattern, and he was making a sound, a loud, wordless sound that the translation unit could not categorize as language. In approximately 20 seconds, the rest of his unit followed him, not in panic. The movement was not organized in the way trained military movements are organized, with coordination and assigned roles and clear objectives. But it was not disorganized either. It was something in between, fast and unpredictable and completely uncontrolled in a way that made it nearly impossible to counter because our tactical models had no category for it. 30 frightened humans moving at full speed without a predictable pattern toward the source of the threat is a very difficult tactical problem to solve in real time. We had not trained for it because we had not believed it was possible. You could not, according to every military and biological framework we had spent centuries developing, experience that level of fear and move toward the source of it. The fear response existed specifically to prevent that outcome. Later, I read a translated interview with that soldier. His name was Owen. He was 23 years old by human reckoning. The interviewer asked him what had been going through his mind during those 20 seconds. Owen said, "Honestly, I was terrified. I could barely think straight, so I just ran at it." I read that sentence 4 times. I was terrified. I could barely think straight, so I just ran at it. There's a logic there that is completely alien to Keth thinking, and yet, when you understand the world that produced it, it is not without its own internal sense. A human who cannot think straight under fear has 2 options: stop and let the fear win, or move and give the fear something to do with itself. Thousands of years of surviving on a planet full of things that would eat them had selected heavily for the second option. We lost 9 soldiers in the engagement that followed. We had gone into it expecting the humans to retreat or collapse. Instead, 30 biologically terrified human beings had used their own fear as a kind of blind, reckless acceleration. Soph, too, stood beside me watching the surveillance feed and said nothing for a very long time. The Psychological Operations Division requested a second opportunity to deploy the package under adjusted parameters. I refused. I told them that the issue was not the parameters. The issue was the assumption underneath the parameters, which was that fear is a force that pushes creatures away from the source of the threat. That assumption had been valid for every species we had ever fought. It was not valid for humans. My refusal was overruled again. The package was deployed a second time, 9 rotations later, against a different human unit. The result was the same. The biometrics climbed. The humans moved toward the source. They moved differently this time, more organized, as if they had learned something from the previous experience and incorporated it, which was itself alarming in a separate way that I will return to later in this testimony. But the fundamental response was identical. Fear did not stop them. It accelerated them. I asked one of our xenobiologists to review the biometric data and give me an explanation. She spent 4 rotations studying it and came back with a report that I found both entirely logical and deeply unsettling. She explained that human fear response evolved in an environment with a very specific threat profile. Their home planet contained numerous large predators capable of ending a human life quickly. The standard fear response, the one that operates in every other species we know of, is optimized for dealing with threats that can be avoided. If you see the predator early enough, you can run away and survive. But humans, early in their evolutionary history, were not fast enough to consistently outrun their predators. They were not strong enough to consistently fight them alone. What they developed instead was collective response. The group moved together. The group made noise. The group charged, not because any individual was brave enough to face the predator alone, but because the group, moving as a unit, could do what no individual could do. And the emotional fuel for this collective charge was the fear itself, amplified and redirected from run away alone into move toward it together. The xenobiologist told me that humans are, to the best of her knowledge, the only sapient species whose fear response evolved under conditions where the most effective survival strategy was to make more noise, take up more space, and move toward the threat rather than away from it. I read her report. Then I went and stood outside in the night air of Duin for a long time. The stars were out. The rain had stopped for once. It was quiet. I thought about 30 frightened human beings running toward a tactical projection that was designed to terrify them. And I thought about what it meant that the designer of the projection had, in his entire professional life, never encountered a species that responded to fear this way. We had spent 300 years perfecting a weapon aimed at the wrong target. Not wrong in the sense of being poorly constructed, wrong in the sense of being aimed at a biological mechanism that worked differently in humans than in everything else we had ever fought. Our psychological warfare package was a masterpiece of applied science for species whose fear drove them away from threats. For a species whose fear drove them toward threats, it was worse than useless. It was an accelerant. On the 41st rotation, I wrote a formal report to the Psychological Operations Division recommending that all further deployment of the standard fear induction package against human forces be suspended indefinitely. I included the xenobiologist's findings. I included the biometric data from both deployments. I included the surveillance footage. The report was acknowledged. No action was taken. On the 53rd rotation, Command authorized a third deployment of the package, this time at a significantly higher intensity against a large human position. The intensity had been increased because the psychological operations team believed that a sufficiently high dose of the stimulus would eventually trigger the biological response they were looking for, regardless of the adaptive differences in the target species. I want to describe what happened during that third deployment clearly and without exaggeration, because what happened is important. The 63 humans in that position showed biometric stress readings that were, in the assessment of our xenobiologist, beyond anything she had previously recorded in a living sapient organism. These were readings that, in a Keth individual, would represent a state of biological crisis. Not fear, not extreme fear, something closer to biological emergency. Those 63 humans, in a state of biological emergency, in terrain they had held for 9 rotations against intermittent Keth assault, did not break. They organized. I watched it on the surveillance feed. They moved to one another. They spoke rapidly and continuously. Several of them appeared to be conducting what I later learned to identify as a planning discussion, literally deciding how to respond to the threat in real time while experiencing what our instruments told us were peak stress levels. They were operating as if the fear was input data rather than an experience. As if it was simply information the environment was providing, the same way a temperature reading is information, and they were deciding what to do with that information rather than being controlled by it. When they moved out of their position, they moved as a coordinated unit. Not slowly, quickly. They did not scatter. They did not retreat. They advanced on the projected weak point of the Keth line because they had just decided, in the middle of a psychological assault designed to make clear thinking impossible, that advancing on the weak point was the right answer. I pulled our line back. There was no tactical advantage in holding it against what was coming. Afterward, alone in my shelter, I thought about Owen, the 23-year-old who had been too scared to think straight and had simply run at the problem. I thought about what it meant that after 2 previous encounters with the fear package, the human forces had adapted their response to include organized planning during peak stress exposure. They had not simply developed a tolerance to the stimulus. They had looked at what was happening to them, understood it well enough to work around it, and developed a more effective response. This is what I will talk about in the final section of my testimony. This is the part that ended the war. But first, Saf 2 asked me another question. He asked, do they not ever break? Is there no level of pressure at which they stop? I told him I had seen human soldiers reach their limits. I had seen units lose cohesion. I had seen individuals who could not continue. Humans are not indestructible, and they are not fearless. Every one of them I ever observed was afraid at some point. Many of them were visibly exhausted. Some reached a point where the body simply stopped working regardless of what the person inside it wanted to do. I told Sa too, yes, they break. The individual breaks. Then the ones around them carry them out, the way I watched a unit carry a wounded soldier across 2 kilometers of contested ground in the early days of the campaign, and the unit goes on. That, I told him, is the thing that does not break. The testimony I am about to give is not based on combat experience. It is based on a single decision I made on the 68th rotation of the Duin 4 campaign, a decision that required me to sit still and do nothing while everything in my training told me to act. 6 human soldiers were cut off behind our lines. It happened during a rapid advance we made in the northeastern sector. We moved faster than the human unit on our left flank could match, and when the dust settled, there were 6 of their soldiers on the wrong side of our new position. They were in a structure we had already assessed as having no tactical value, an old materials storage building with damaged walls and no power. They were wounded. Our medical drones had tracked 3 of them taking hits during the chaos of the advance. They had limited supplies. Our supply interdiction had been effective in that area for 11 rotations. By any reasonable calculation, those 6 humans were done. My field commander, a young officer named Reth, for who had only recently been promoted and was very eager to demonstrate sound tactical judgment, came to me with a recommendation. He recommended we send a small unit to neutralize the 6 human soldiers and clear them from our rear. He said it was a minor operation and would take perhaps 2 hours. I told him no. He looked at me the way young officers look at senior ones when they believe the senior one has made an obvious mistake. He showed me the assessment again. 6 soldiers wounded, cut off, undersupplied, no strategic value in their position, no likely relief within any meaningful time frame. I told him I understood the assessment. I told him we were going to leave them alone and watch what happened. He did not agree with this. He went over my head and requested a second opinion from Command. Command backed my call, largely because at this point in the campaign, my record of being right about things involving humans had earned me a certain amount of deference. Ref 4 accepted the decision unhappily and spent the next 11 days regularly presenting me with updated assessments that all said the same thing. 6 wounded, isolated humans in a damaged building with dwindling supplies. What the assessments did not adequately capture was what was actually happening in that building. I was watching it on drone surveillance. Not continuously, but in daily reviews that gave me a clear picture of how those 11 days unfolded. I want to describe what I saw, because I believe it is the most important thing I witnessed in the entire Doin 4 campaign. On the first day, the 6 soldiers consolidated their position. The word that comes to mind is efficient. They were methodical. 3 of them were significantly hurt and could not move freely. The other 3 took on all the physical tasks and divided them without any apparent argument or negotiation. It happened quickly and without drama, as if the allocation of roles was obvious and needed no discussion. Whoever was least hurt did the most. This seemed to be simply understood. On the second day, they began to modify the building, not to make it more comfortable, to make it more defensible. They moved debris to create cover positions with sight lines to the 2 main entry points. They took materials from the non-essential parts of the structure and used them to reinforce the corners where the roof damage created exposure. One of the mobile soldiers spent approximately 4 hours constructing what I eventually identified as a simple early warning system using scavenged materials and wire. If someone came through the east entrance without triggering it deliberately, it would make noise. The 3 wounded soldiers did not rest while this was happening. They could not do the physical work, but they were not passive. They were talking, and I had audio from the drone, and when I had the recordings translated, I found something I had not expected. They were planning. Not just what to do if we attacked, what to do when the rescue came, where to position themselves to be extracted quickly, what information to bring back about the kept positions they had observed since being cut off. One of them, a woman named Laura who had a severe wound to her right leg and could barely shift her position, was creating a map by memory of everything she had seen during the advance, drawing it on the inner wall of the building with a piece of charred debris. She was making a map. She was cut off, seriously hurt, 11 rotations from any likely rescue, and she was being useful with the time. On the 4th day, we sent a probe toward the building, not to attack, to observe how they responded. I wanted to see their threat response. The mobile soldiers moved to their prepared positions within seconds. One of them, a man named Garrett, who seemed to be the unofficial leader of the group despite having no apparent rank advantage over the others, positioned himself at the point I would have chosen if I were defending that structure. He stayed there completely still for 40 minutes after the probe withdrew, before deciding the immediate threat had passed. Garrett had a wound across his upper torso that our medical drone estimated would have caused significant pain with any movement above the waist. He held his position for 40 minutes with his weapon raised and his breathing controlled. I watched his biometrics. His heart rate was elevated but steady. He was not in a calm state. He was in a state of controlled readiness that somehow coexisted with what had to be considerable physical discomfort. On the 6th day, Command offered me the option to open a communication channel with the human soldiers and offer them safe passage out in exchange for surrender. I accepted the option. I opened the channel myself. A voice came back quickly. Not Garrett. A younger voice, a little rough at the edges. The voice said, "We're good. Send more." I closed the channel. Ref 4 was standing behind me. He said, "Send more what?" I told him I believed it was an idiomatic expression indicating that the occupants of the building did not wish to discuss surrender at this time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are 6 of them. They've been there for 6 days. 2 of the wounded are not going to get better without medical treatment. How are they still talking like that?" I did not answer him immediately. I had been asking myself a version of the same question since the first day. The answer, I had begun to realize, was simple and terrible at the same time. They were talking like that because they believed someone was coming for them. Not because they had received any communication indicating rescue was on the way. Not because the tactical situation gave any rational support for that belief. They believed it because, in their experience, that was what happened. When members of your group were left behind, the group came back for them. This was so deeply ingrained in human military culture, in human culture broadly, that it was not even a hope in the conventional sense of the word. It was closer to a certainty. The 6 soldiers in that building were not holding out against despair. They were holding out with confidence, the confidence of people who knew, at some level below rational calculation, that they were not forgotten. On the 9th day, one of the wounded soldiers, a man named Pete, deteriorated significantly. His wound had become infected in the absence of proper treatment. He was running a high fever. Laura, who was still making entries on her wall map with her charred piece of debris, stopped updating the map and focused entirely on him. She could not treat the infection with what they had, but she monitored him. She talked to him. When he was too confused from the fever to respond coherently, she kept talking anyway. Garrett, who was running surveillance on the entry points, rotated back every 90 minutes to check on them, even though the rotation made the surveillance less thorough. Pete survived. I'm telling you this now because I want you to know the ending before I describe the 10th and 11th days. He survived. He needed 2 additional surgeries after the rescue and was in medical care for a long time afterward, but he was alive when the armistice was signed. I looked it up specifically. On the 10th day, Ref 4 came to me again. By now his demeanor had changed considerably. He was no longer presenting assessments. He sat down beside me at the surveillance station and just watched the footage. After a while, he said, "What are they getting out of this? Objectively, what is the benefit of staying and fighting rather than surrendering?" They would receive medical treatment. Pete would receive immediate care. They can negotiate terms. I told him it was the right question. I told him the answer was that from a purely individual standpoint, there was no rational benefit to what they were doing. Surrendering and accepting medical care was a better outcome for each of them personally, considered in isolation. He thought about that. Then he said, "So why don't they?" I said, "Because they are not considering themselves in isolation." He looked at me. I said, "From a moment they were cut off, not one of them has made a single decision based solely on their own individual situation. Every decision has been made based on the group. What does the group need right now? What is the best outcome for everyone here? That is the frame. Surrender would be a better individual outcome, but it would mean making a decision about everyone. And that is not one person's decision to make alone. So they wait for the group to decide together. And the group, being human, decides to wait for the people who are coming." Ref 4 sat with that for a while. Outside, the rain had started again. It was always raining in that sector. He said, quietly, "What happens if we're the ones they're waiting for and we never come?" I told him that was not going to happen. And I told him I had known it was not going to happen since approximately the 4th day. Because on the 4th day, our long-range surveillance had detected increased human military activity approximately 30 kilometers to the southwest, in exactly the direction that a rescue force would approach from if it was moving toward the building. Ref 4's head came up quickly. "They're already moving? Since day 4? I told him yes. I told him I had known it was coming, and I had chosen not to attack the building precisely because I had wanted Ref 4 and Command, and eventually this council, to see what happened in that building for as long as possible before it ended. Because what happened in that building was the answer to every question about why the Keth hegemony was not going to win this war. The rescue arrived on the 11th day. It was a unit of 22 soldiers, and they had moved through 30 kilometers of contested territory with remarkable speed. They entered the building, and the 6 who were inside came out, and the wounded ones were assisted, and Pete was carried on a stretcher, and Laura was helped to walk, and Garrett, who was last out of the building, paused at the entrance and looked back once. Then they were gone. The building had been held for 11 days. 6 wounded, isolated, undersupplied soldiers had held it. 43 Keth soldiers had been allocated to the containment perimeter. 3 separate probes had been repelled. A direct communication offering safe passage had been declined. When I gave the final assessment to Command, the numbers were in the report. 43 Keth casualties against the containment of 6 human soldiers over 11 days, all 6 of whom survived to rejoin active duty. Command asked what recommendation I derived from these numbers. I told them the recommendation was the same one I had been making since the ninth rotation of the campaign. I told them we needed to understand, at a fundamental level, that we were not going to grind the humans down. The assumptions that underpinned our attrition model were based on what happens to most species under sustained pressure. They held for most species because most species, when isolated and outnumbered and undersupplied, eventually make the rational individual decision and stop fighting. Humans did not make that decision because they did not frame the decision that way. They always, automatically, instinctively framed it as a group decision. And a group, in human psychology, does not abandon its members. Ever. Not for any tactical benefit. Not for any individual advantage. An army that will not abandon its members is an army that does not have the same breaking point that other armies have. I put in writing. Command read it. Then they authorized another 6 months of operations. The 6 months cost us considerably. The final part of my testimony is not about a battle. It is not about a soldier's courage or a unit's endurance or any single act of remarkable persistence. It is about a piece of paper, or rather what was on it, and what a xenopsychologist said in a closed room 300 days into the campaign, and why the Keth hegemony stopped fighting. We did not stop because we ran out of resources, though resources had become strained. We did not stop because the political will had collapsed, though it had been weakening for some time. We did not stop because of any single defeat, because there had been many defeats and we had absorbed them. We stopped because of a briefing. I was not in the room for the original briefing. I received a summary afterward through a chain of contacts because the contents were classified at a level above my clearance. What I am about to describe is my understanding of that briefing, pieced together from sources I consider reliable, and I offer it here as testimony with the appropriate caveat that some details may be imprecise. The shape of it, however, I believe to be accurate. The briefing was delivered by a xenopsychologist named Veith, 12. She had spent most of the campaign studying captured human cultural material, translated communications, observed behavioral patterns, and the collected biometric and surveillance data from every engagement on Do and 4. Her specialty was adaptive behavior analysis, the study of how a species changes its responses to new challenges over time. She had published extensively on Keth adaptive rates during previous conflicts and was considered the leading expert in the field. She presented a single data set to the War Cabinet. The data set compared two things. The first was the Keth hegemony's military doctrine over the period of the Do 4 campaign. The second was the observed human military response patterns over the same period. The Keth doctrine had not changed. This was not a failure of imagination or a bureaucratic failing. Keth military doctrine worked. It had worked for 300 years across dozens of campaigns. The strategic principles that the hegemony had developed over that period were sound and well-tested, and there was no pressing reason to modify them. We fought in the way we had always fought because the way we had always fought was effective. The human response patterns, on the other hand, had changed 7 times. Not in the sense of adopting completely different strategies, in the sense of continuous refinement. Every engagement we had with human forces produced a measurable adjustment in how they approached the next engagement. The psychological warfare failure on the 31st rotation had resulted, by the 40th rotation, in the organized planning under fear response I described earlier. The night operation failure in the Hethra Basin had resulted, within 2 weeks, in changes to their sentry protocols. The siege pattern at the storage building had resulted in documentation that was, according to our intelligence, being distributed across human military units as a training resource. They were turning losses into lessons and distributing those lessons to everyone. Every battle was being studied. Every setback was being analyzed. Every moment where Keth tactics had succeeded against them was being converted into a question. Why did that work? And how do we make sure it does not work again? The Keth hegemony was not doing this. We had no institutional mechanism for that kind of rapid, widespread adaptation. Our doctrine was designed for stability, for consistent application of principles that had been tested over time. We did not have a system for saying, in the middle of a campaign, that an entire strategic assumption was wrong and needs to be replaced. Veith, 12 presented a projected timeline based on the rate of human adaptation she had observed. Her projection showed that if the campaign continued at current pace, the human tactical performance, which had started significantly below ours, would reach parity with Keth forces within approximately 60 days. It would exceed Keth capability within 120 days. Not because humans would suddenly have better weapons or more soldiers, because they would have spent 120 more days learning from every single engagement they had with us, incorporating every lesson into their practice, and distributing those improved practices across their entire military force. The War Cabinet sat with that for a while. Then someone asked the question that I believe changed everything. The question was, if we end this campaign and sign an armistice, and the humans keep learning after the shooting stops, where will their military capability be in 10 years? Veith, 12, said she could not answer that question with precision. She said she could say with confidence that the learning would not stop. Humans, she explained, did not stop adapting when the immediate pressure was removed. They made it into a practice. They built institutions for it. They created entire systems for examining what they had done and identifying what could be done better, not just in military terms, but in every area of their civilization. She described this process using a human word that does not translate neatly into Keth. The closest we can get is something like the habit of improving. It describes a cultural orientation toward continuous refinement that is so deeply embedded in human civilization that it shows up in every domain, from how they build their technology to how they raise their young. It is not something they turn on during crises. It is simply how they operate. The War Cabinet ended the session early. There were extended, closed consultations. I received my summary from a contact in the Strategic Communications Division 3 days later. The summary was brief. It said that the fundamental issue was not whether we could defeat human forces on Doin 4. The fundamental issue was what kind of opponents they would be in 10 years if we spent those 10 years continuing to teach them everything we knew about how the Keth hegemony fights wars. Every engagement was a lesson. Every Keth tactic used against human forces became data that human analysts would study and adapt to. We were not fighting an opponent. We were teaching a student, and the student, unlike any student any Keth military institution had ever trained, was learning faster than the teacher had anticipated. The armistice negotiations began shortly after. I was given access to a small package of human cultural materials in the final weeks before the armistice was signed. It was provided through an exchange of non-military materials that was part of the broader negotiations, a gesture of good faith on both sides. I received a selection of human literature, music, scientific papers, and educational materials. I was invited to choose freely. I chose a children's book. I chose it because I had been thinking throughout the final weeks of the campaign about Veith 12's description of the human habit of improving. I had been thinking about where that habit comes from. Not biologically. I understood the biology. I was thinking about how it gets from one generation to the next. How a species that has been living this way for 40,000 years makes sure the next generation knows to keep living this way. The answer, of course, is in what they tell their children. The book I received was called something that translates roughly as The Small One. It is the story of a small creature who lives in a large forest. In the beginning of the book, the creature is the weakest thing in the forest. Larger creatures do not pay much attention to it. The forest itself seems indifferent to whether it lives or dies. The creature is afraid of many things. Over the course of the book, the creature encounters each of the things that frighten it, not in triumphant ways, not with special powers or fortunate circumstances. It encounters them, and it is frightened, and it gets hurt sometimes, and it keeps going anyway. It learns from each encounter. It becomes slowly, incrementally, not invincible, but more capable, better at noticing things, better at remembering what worked before, better at finding allies, better at using what it knows. By the final pages, the forest is different, not because the creature changed it, because the creature became something the forest had not accounted for. The other creatures, the larger ones who used to ignore it, have begun to pay attention. One of them, a very old predator who had lived in that forest for longer than any other creature, says to another near the end of the book, "I have been here a long time. I have seen many things come and go, but I have never seen something that would not stop learning." And the last line of the book, addressed to a child reader, says, "Do you know what the forest felt at the end? It felt what the small one used to feel. It felt afraid." I sat with that book for a long time after reading it. I have held this testimony together reasonably well up to now. I have been precise, and I have been analytical, and I have given the council what I believe they need to understand the strategic decisions that led to the armistice. I am a soldier. This is what I do. I take what I observed and I describe it clearly. But I want to be honest about what that book did to me, because I think honesty is more useful here than composure. I read that book and I thought about a young soldier on a ridge on Din, 4 with 2 plasma hits in his body, getting up from the dirt and raising his weapon. I thought about Carla, the medic standing in the mud of the Hethra Basin, more annoyed than frightened, worried about whether her unit was worried about her. I thought about Owen, who had been too scared to think straight and had solved that problem by running toward the thing that scared him. I thought about Laura in the damaged storage building, hurt and cut off, and making map on the wall because the time might as well be useful. And I thought about the children's book, about a civilization that looked at all of that history, all of those qualities that had carried their people through everything the universe had thrown at them, and decided that the most important thing was to make sure the children knew. Make sure they understood who they were and where they came from and what it meant. Make sure the next generation grew up already knowing that the forest can be frightened of you if you are willing to keep learning. I thought about what we tell our children. We tell them to be strong, to be disciplined, to uphold the traditions of the hegemony, to serve with honor. These are good things to tell children. I believe in all of them. But we do not tell our children's story about the small one who became what the forest feared. We do not sit them down and say, whatever happens, do not stop learning from it. Whatever happens, carry your people with you. Whatever happens, use the fear. That is not a criticism of Keth culture. Our culture has given us 300 years of stability and military success across dozens of worlds. We are not a small creature in a large forest. We were until Duin for the forest. What Duin for taught me is that the forest can change. I have been asked in informal conversations since the armistice whether I believe the Keth hegemony made the right decision in stopping the war when it did. It is a complicated question, and I will not answer it the way a politician would. I will answer it the way a soldier would. I believe we stopped when we did because Veeth 12 showed the war cabinet a clock. She showed them that time was working against us in a way that artillery and blockades could not compensate for. The longer the war went on, the better the humans became at fighting it. That is a clock you cannot shoot. But I also believe that the armistice was the right decision for a reason that does not appear in Veeth 12's timeline projections. It was the right decision because there is a particular kind of wisdom in understanding that you have met something genuinely new in the universe, something that does not fit the categories you have been using, and responding to that by choosing to study it rather than fight it. The children's book sits on a shelf in my quarters on the Keth warship. It is the only personal item I kept from the entire campaign. My contact in strategic communications asked me why I kept a children's book and not something of more obvious military or cultural significance. I told her it was the most significant thing I brought back, because it told me what they are teaching the children, and what the children grow into, and what the next generation of that species is going to be if they keep teaching them that way. The council members in this room are looking at me with various expressions that I have learned over the years to read accurately. Some of them are looking at me with the expression that means they are processing something difficult and need time. Some are looking at me with the expression that means they believe I have been affected emotionally by my experiences in a way that may have compromised my analytical judgment. To those in the second category, I want to say one more thing before I close this testimony. After I read the children's book, I could not sleep for the first time in 40 years of military service. Not because I was afraid of the humans on Duin 4. The ceasefire was holding. No one was shooting at me. I could not sleep because I kept thinking about what Veeth 12 said, not the timeline. The thing underneath the timeline. The thing that makes the timeline possible. A species that has not stopped learning. A species that has built that habit into their culture so deeply that they put it in stories for their smallest children. A species that has been doing this for 40,000 years and has, in that time, come from a single world with limited technology to the edge of our territory, learning from every obstacle along the way. I was not afraid of the army. We had just stopped fighting. I was thinking about the army that army is going to produce. The children who will read that book and grow up already knowing what the small one learned in the forest. The soldiers who will have been told, from the beginning, that the appropriate response to something frightening is to learn what frightens it and remember that knowledge and pass it on. That is the army I could not sleep thinking about. Not what they are becoming. I have nothing else to add to this testimony. I request that it be entered into the record in full, without summary or edit, as I was promised when I began. I am a soldier of the Keth hegemony, and I have served with honor. I will continue to serve. But I will also tell you this, and I mean it without drama and without exaggeration, as a simple statement of my professional assessment after everything I saw in Doing 4. Keep the armistice. Keep it carefully. Keep it for a very long time. And in the years while it holds, find out what they are teaching their children. Because those children are going to grow up, and they will remember everything.